There's more drama in the chess world. I'm going to show you a sensational game. I'm switching from the US Championship to the Qatar Masters, taking place in Qatar, of course. So this is a phenomenally strong open tournament, 9 rounds. It's attracted Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, and a host of other chess superstars, incredibly strong. In the first round, Carlsen crushed his opponent. In the second round, he faced 23-year-old Alisher Suleymenov from Kazakhstan. And here is what happened. And let me tell you, it's all blowing up on social media as well after this game. Let's see. A solid start from both players. Carlsen goes for the Queen's Indian, an opening with an excellent reputation. The bishop usually comes to the long diagonal, and black seeks to control the e4 square. So very sound, bringing out that Queen's bishop before you develop the bishop on f8. a3, the so-called Petrosian system. First played, or one of the first players to play this was Sultan Khan. He defeated Capablanca in Hastings. But yes, given the name Petrosian system, and Kasparov was a great favourite. Was like this move very much. The idea is that you want to play knight c3 without allowing bishop b4. So in that way, white gets a little bit more control over e4. And if bishop b7, which is also one of the main moves, then knight c3, and you can play d5 here, for example, which is sort of akin to a queen's gambit. But if you want to play c5, then white can close things, and that's like a favourable Benoni. So instead of bishop b7, Carlsen played bishop a6. So this is the clever way of playing this. And however white protects that pawn on c4, then it involves a slight compromise. So the most popular move here is queen c2. For example, if you play a normal move like e3, then d5, that's a bit annoying because white doesn't really want to take here because black will exchange off, and that's awkward for white's king. So the most popular move is queen c2, which controls e4, protects the pawn obviously, and now the bishop hits b7. So it comes back to the long diagonal. So black has more control over the e4 square. Now what's the difference between the position with the queen on d1 and the queen on c2? The difference is that black plays c5. And if white wants to play d5, then, well, you can do it, but it's a speculative pawn sacrifice. So this is the point. You flick in bishop a6, then come back to b7, and the queen is on c2. So it means that black is able to challenge the pawn on d4. Now structurally, that's rather nice for black. If white exchanges, you have more pawns in the middle. So that's why white plays e4 and constructs a strong central position. But black exchanges on d4, and now we have, well, rather a fairly typical Marozzi bind or hedgehog position, with white having these pawns on e4 and c4, so controls a lot of space. But black's setup is very elastic, and black can often break out from this position. You might recall a game of Karpov's that went like this. Larry Christensen against Anatoly Karpov. Karpov, the great Soviet world champion. And that game went like this. Karpov played knight c6. Christensen exchanged. Bishop f4. Looking to control some nice squares here. Knight h5. Bishop came back to e3. And Karpov played bishop d6. Looking to get some control over these squares. And after queen d1, Karpov resigned, because that is a simple double attack. of course, there were improvements to that. In fact, later on in the year, Karpov played Queen b8 and won an absolute positional masterpiece. I might go into that another time. What I want to say is that knight c6 is a perfectly respectable move here. And I think exchanging off a pair of knights actually does help black's position to a certain extent, because it's a little bit cramped. Carlsen played bishop c5, also a very respectable move. Attacking the knight, so just pushing that knight back away from this active square. And if that's supported, let's say with bishop e3, then you have the traditional move knight g4. That's very awkward. So the knight came back to f3. And then knight c6. And b4. Well, it's an interesting moment because I wonder if it had originally been Carlsen's intention to play knight d4 and then he thought better of it. Of course, if white exchanges, then this looks a little bit uncomfortable. The bishop is in excellent position, pressure on e4. But white can play queen d2, attacking this. Obviously the bishop is attacked as well. So an exchange of pieces. Now the bishop retreats, and rook g1. With a semi-open g-file, in fact, this is really dangerous, and the queen is looking down here too, and maybe the bishop will come to the long diagonal. And white's centre is secure. I know these double pawns in the long run might not be attractive, but in the short term, black's king could be in difficulty. So maybe Carlsen thought twice about that. And, well, after 4 minutes, he put his bishop back on e7. He was spending some time here. He spent almost 5 minutes on knight c6 and 4 minutes on bishop e7. So an indication he's not completely familiar with this opening. Bishop b2 from white. Well, the bishop looks excellent on the long diagonal. Queen b8 from Carlsen, controlling squares here. So that's a very, controlling squares on this diagonal. A very typical move for these hedgehog positions. Rook d1 also looks very natural. Putting some pressure on the d-file. And Carlsen castled. And bishop e2 from white. d6 from Carlsen, and then castles kingside. So both sides brought their kings to safety, and the middle game is beginning. Now normally in these so-called hedgehog setups, black needs to break out. Black needs one of these pawn breaks, either b5, attacking the pawn on c4, trying to break down the pawn on c4, or d5, trying to break out that way, just blowing up the position. But in this case, it's not easy for black to break free, because white has successfully put the pawn on b4. In many hedgehog positions, this is impossible, because it would leave that c-pawn weak. But here, Suleymenov has put the knight on f3, guarding the e5 square. So, for example, rook c8 and knight e5, which might be a normal response to attack that pawn. Well, of course, that knight can just be exchanged off, and there's no danger. And this is very strong. It's also difficult to break it down with a5, because that pawn can just be protected by the queen, and difficult to put further pressure on. And what about the b5 break? Well, white is very well set up to control that, with the knight and bishop trained on b5, so that's not doing anything. So anyway, Carlsen played rook c8 quite quickly. Looks natural to put the rook opposite the queen. Rook e1, there's no panic. There's no threat to break and open the c-file. Bishop f8 from Carlsen. Yeah, with the rook on e1, you never know when a knight d5 might happen, and that bishop could be loose. Also, the bishop covers g7. Bishop f1, tidy move. So these rooks look really nice. It's not absolutely clear what white is doing at the moment, but in these kind of positions, if white can simply hold the centre together and not allow any of these pawn breaks, then that is an achievement in itself. You just want to contain black. What you do next, that'll happen naturally, because normally black tries to break free and then you react. So, but the first thing is make sure that black isn't breaking out. Now, let me see. Well, let's just have a very quick look at that move, knight e5. As I mentioned, if the knight weren't here, then that would be good to attack this. But here we can see knight takes, pawn takes, and white is really secure. The queen can come to b3, stepping away from the c-file. It looks like a very healthy pawn majority. That bishop can't do anything at all. And there could be weaknesses down the d-file on d6 here. You know, later on knight b5 might be possible. Okay, so there's an alternative here, which is knight d7, putting the other knight on e5. So, for example, let's play queen b3. That feels tidy. And then knight de5. Now, if white exchanges, pawn takes. Now, this time there's a difference. You can see the pawn controls d4, and the knight might well hop into d4. And there's also perhaps a5 with some pressure here. But of course, after knight e5, white doesn't need to exchange. You could play knight g5. And these pieces rather tread on each other's toes. It's not possible to put any more pressure here. And white is making room for that pawn to advance to f4. And the queen, which sometimes in the hedgehog looks quite good on b8, it looks just too far from the scene of action on the king side. Right, none of that happened. But that's just to illustrate that Carlsen finds himself in some difficulty here. It's very hard for black to break free. He tried knight e7. But watch what happened. Knight b5. Attacking this pawn. And also opening up the diagonal. Now, if knight g6... then white could take on f6. That damages the king side. Maybe queen d2. Bit of pressure here. I mean, there's no real threat to take it. But that queen takes control of some squares here. Maybe h4, h5 is possible. Or maybe move the knight and advance the f-pawn. You can see that black's queen is still miles away from the king side. And the king looks a little bit insecure there. So after knight b5, Carlsen played knight e8, protecting the pawn. But Suleymenov went for it. Knight g5. And this looks completely appropriate to throw the knight in, because black's pieces are so boxed in. If black could play h6, Carlsen didn't do this, and just drive the knight away, well, fine. Problem is, watch what happens. You can take on f7 and then just play e5. Exchanging would leave the queen in desperate trouble. And otherwise, well, if you don't exchange, you can see the queen's diagonal is opened up. If rook d8, you can simply switch to an attack on the e-pawn. This is so powerful. Black's pieces are just stuck way across the other side of the board, and white has a very easy attack here. So coming back to this position, knight g5. Carlsen did not play h6. He played knight g6, trying to sort of straighten things out a little bit. So now the knight and the bishop attack here. e5 anyway, it's a really powerful move, opening up the queen's diagonal. So clearly this knight can't take, and if pawn takes, yeah, leaves black's queen in trouble because knight takes is impossible because of queen h7. So if Carlsen can't take that pawn, well, what else can he do? It's really nasty. Try to keep things closed with d5, but watch what happened. Queen b3. So just stepping out of the pin and lining up on this diagonal. Well, just look what happens again if h6 is played. You can take here and then you just eliminate everything on the diagonal. And here, for example, knight d4 threatens queen e6, threatens knight f5. It's absolutely horrible for black. Carlsen played bishop e7, but knight f7 anyway. And again, just clearing that diagonal. So at the moment, Suleymenov is a piece down for a storming attack. Now he's a whole rook down. And again, it's that move, not d4. So that knight is floating around into e6. He's a rook down, but wow. Look at white's pieces. They are just tremendous. So how does Carlsen deal with this threat? There's also thought of queen f3. That might be very awkward. There's also bishop c4. But yeah, obviously knight e6 is the main threat in this position. Knight f4 played, hitting the queen, which did go back to f3. That's a very nasty pin. King g8, queen f4. Now Suleymenov is only the exchange down. Well, in fact, he's no material down. He has a bishop and 2 pawns for a rook and an absolutely tremendous attack. So black's piece is still miles away from the king side. Knight f5, of course, it looks wonderful. If bishop f8, then e6, the pawn advances, is going to go all the way to e7. I mean, this is not complicated. Carlsen played b5. Well, he was also worried about bishop c4, but it's no bother. That just got taken. Queen takes bishop. If queen takes bishop, then knight check and checkmate. Carlsen played bishop f8, but bishop c4 check anyway. King at the corner. And after knight h6, threatening queen takes bishop, Magnus Carlsen resigned after just 31 moves. Extraordinary. Okay, well, let's just clear up why exactly did he resign. Well, queen takes bishop threatened. Let's look at a couple of alternatives. So what about bishop e7? Queen in. It's fatal, threatening queen g8. And if knight d6, you can take that. This is not looking good for black. It's absolutely crushing. Threatening this one, for example, threatening the queen. And if rook takes bishop, well, that leads to mate. And finally, what about queen e7? Okay, let's give a check. Well, just to put the king on that diagonal is pretty bad. And you can just play bishop b3. I mean, white's pieces can't be touched here. Completely invulnerable. So, in fact, I mean, what white can do, you can simply give a check and take a rook here if you want the material back. But in fact, it's much more efficient just to keep the knight on f7 for the moment and play here. Just switch the rook over, threatening mate. Okay, let's keep going. Takes here and checkmate, for example. Anyway, that's the final position, completely crushing. Now, when was the last time you saw Magnus Carlsen lose a game as badly as that? I mean, it was a complete crush. Beautifully played by Alisher Suleymenov. Now, not long after the game, that's when things really kicked off. I mean, if that's not sensational enough, because on Twitter, or X as it's now called, Magnus Carlsen tweeted, and he said this: I was completely crushed in my game today. This is not to accuse my opponent of anything, who played an amazing game and deserved to win. But honestly, as soon as I saw my opponent was wearing a watch early in the game, I lost my ability to concentrate. I obviously take responsibility for my inability to deal with those thoughts properly. But it's also incredibly frustrating to see organisers still not taking anti-cheating seriously at all. And then in brackets, no transmission delay, spectators walking around the playing hall with smartphones. And of course, it all kicked off because everyone piled in then saying, oh, Carlsen's a sore loser. You know, you only make that statement after losing badly. And, you know, why didn't you speak to the organisers before? And so on and so on. I have to say, I have a lot of sympathy for Carlsen in this case. Organisers need to take these kind of measures, anti-cheating measures, really seriously. Everyone needs to be above suspicion. And let's just repeat what Carlsen said at the beginning. This is not to accuse my opponent of anything, who played an amazing game and deserved to win. Carlsen states that very plainly. Carlsen got psyched out, but organisers need to do much better. There is no doubt about that. And it's interesting that another of the world's top players came in afterwards and said this. This is Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Maxime said this: absolutely agree with this take, agrees with Carlsen. Players need to unite to get anti-cheating measures in place at every tournament. To hinder cheaters, obviously, and to avoid people doubting every great performance, as I already saw a few bad tweets throwing shade at Alisher's brilliancy today. So that's interesting. It works both ways. It's not just, the sour grapes. It's that we can all absolutely be sure that when someone produces a brilliancy like this, that it is completely above board. I'm sure it's above board. But yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for Magnus Carlsen, I have to say. Maybe his timing wasn't quite right with this tweet, but yeah, I think organisers need to do it a bit better. It's quite possible that he's spoken to the organisers already behind the scenes. We don't know. But in this case, I agree with Magnus.